Every empire contains the seed of its own destruction, not as a moral judgment, but as a material fact. And rarely has that contradiction been on clearer display than the United States today. What is presented to us is a coherent strategy: a war on China, a siege on Russia, the kidnapping of Venezuela's Maduro. The drumbeat against Iran is not, in truth, a plan at all. It is a series of desperate, erratic spasms, each one intended to preserve a single fragile thing: the US dollar dominion over the global economy. Because without that, the entire financialized house of cards begins to tremble. And here lay bare the contradiction of capitalism. In trying to isolate China, Washington is itself isolating itself. In waging war on Iran, it has choked the world's most vital resources, oil and gas. Global shipping is disrupted, prices are volatile, and the Gulf monarchies, America's own allies, find themselves unable to sell their crude at stable volumes, while their damaged energy infrastructure requires billions and several years to repair, diminishing revenue that would have otherwise been invested in US capital, salvaging the US trade deficit and its financial model. It is for this reason that Aaron Brown, a former head of financial market research at AQR Capital Management, just last week wrote a piece in Bloomberg titled, "How the Iran War Broke the Petrodollar System." And who suffers? Not China necessarily, but rather the United States' own allies, that being South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the European Union, all of whom are major oil importers and gas importers. Specifically, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are dependent on affordable energy in order to power their advanced technological industries, which are the very industries, mind you, that prop up the US tech sector. In fact, around 60 to 70% of America's semiconductor supply, its AI production, its advanced machinery, all come from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Thus, if energy becomes too expensive, their competitive edge erodes. And so does the United States, which directly opposes, rather, the United States' aim of leading the tech innovation, and as such, threatening the AI bubble that is artificially inflating the US economy. Simultaneously to all this, the US has made it a formal policy as of last year to achieve global energy dominance. However, it lacks the economic capacity to deliver on becoming the world's energy hub. And instead, the only thing it is truly accomplishing is to strangle the allies, or rather its allies, whilst accelerating the very demise that it is trying to postpone. Now, none of this is accidental, nor is it brilliant. 20 years ago, the Brookings Institute published a paper known as The Path to Persia, a policy paper cited by many as testament to the US grand objectives in Iran. However, if one studies that paper, the report that was published, again, almost 20 years ago now, it warned that almost any scenario of war with Iran would damage the United States. Such a war, they concluded, would be an option of last resort. And that is where we are today. Worse yet is that the geopolitical realities of the world and the state of the US economy itself have drastically altered since the publication of said paper. And that change is to the detriment of the US, therefore worsening the prospects of the war against Iran. Therefore, what we are witnessing is not the cunning of empire, but rather its exhaustion. And to help us understand and navigate the material forces behind this unraveling and why the US war on China is eating away at the American empire itself, we're joined today by a very distinguished guest, that is geopolitical economist, Professor Radhika Desai. Welcome, Professor, and thank you so much for being here to have this discussion with me today.
Great to be here, Alina. Thanks very much for having me.
Now, obviously, for those that don't know Professor Radhika, which I'm sure most people do, you've obviously spoken quite extensively as to the rise of the global south, the alternative parallel, I guess, financial infrastructures that are being developed through things like BRICS, the New Development Bank, and all these projects that are being essentially geared forward by China, but also by Iran and by Russia. And at the same time, you've also spoken extensively about the dire state of the US economy itself. And in fact, recently, there was, I guess, an article that was published by Steve Hank, and he's a professor of applied economics at the Johns Hopkins University. So what we're speaking about here is, mainstream economists, Keynesian economists as well, for that fact, who are now publishing essentially papers that have declared that the U.S. could be classified as technically insolvent. And this is quite a bold statement to make, and it also speaks volumes as to, I guess, the kind of realization, the reckoning that is taking place right now in the US. So that's one thing. At the same time, we're seeing sort of this, bubbles essentially that are kind of inflating across the board within the United States, across all its industries, which effectively allow for the United States to be able to sustain its economy through the creation of fictitious capital that are also at risk. And how, at the same time, we're also seeing articles published again recently in Bloomberg, by economic experts who are now saying that the Iran war has broken the petrodollar system. So I guess my question to you is, first of all, if you could break down what that insolvency means for the United States, how the Iran war sort of plays into that as part of its imperial overreach, the boomerang effect, or rather the contradictions that this will have in the United States, and sort of frame it as well within the context of all the bubbles within most of its industries that are currently sustaining the US economy, but also, I guess, and you can break it down as in whatever way you want, how this is somewhat also accelerating the dollarization within the context of the Iran war.
Yeah, so that's a lot of different questions, but let me just take answer what answer some of them, and maybe if you have left out any important ones, you can come back to them. So you mentioned the dollar system on the one hand and the bubbles on the other. And let me begin there because I think that, a lot of people, first of all, a lot of people most people don't realize what shaky foundations the dollar system rests on. So, and the reason they don't realize that is that for the last many decades, at least going back to the 70s, you've had this little army of mostly American, US based scholars who have been arguing that it's perfectly natural for the dollar to be the world's money, whether it's because the United States is the most powerful economy in the world. And just as, in the past, sterling was the world's money when Britain was dominant, so now the dollar must be the world's money because the dollar is dominant, etc. Now, quite apart from the many differences between the sterling system as it existed and the dollar system as it has tried to exist in more recent decades, there is absolutely nothing natural about this. Money is national. And the idea, the attempt to make national money into world money is always bound to be beset with a lot of problems. But this school has tried to make us used to that. Secondly, typically when you talk about the dollar system, people talk about official reserves. So, they say that, look at the dollar system is so powerful because China and Japan and Europe and wherever not, they are all accumulating dollars. You can see that their reserves, they're all accumulating reserves in dollars. And so that means that the dollar system is very strong. In reality, as I've shown in my work, since 1971, when the gold link was broken, and the gold link was never sustainable, even when it was promised back in 1945. So it was not sustainable, it was not sustained, and it had to be broken in 1971. And so since that time, the dollar system has essentially rested on vast expansions of purely financial activity. And the reason for that is that, unlike the sterling system, under which the UK provided the rest of the world with liquidity, with dollars with which to trade with, by exporting capital, something it could do because it was drawing vast surpluses from its empire. In contrast to that, the United States, with no empire to draw surpluses from, basically took to providing the world with liquidity by running deficits. So essentially buying goods and services from the rest of the world and paying it with dollars that it essentially created or printed, as we sometimes say. And this system, as the Belgian economist Robert Triffin pointed out long ago, in 1958, 1960, thereabouts, this system was bound to be problematic because the bigger the deficits, the more liquidity the US provides, the less attractive the dollar becomes because the deficits make the dollar less attractive. So this is a dilemma. How should you do it? And because precisely of the operation of this dilemma between 1945 and 1971, or rather 60, around 61 actually, the United States, basically US trading partners said, don't pay us in dollars, pay us in gold instead, since you have promised to exchange dollars for gold. And then and this very soon, between 58 and 61, had led to a collapse of the dollars that the United States was really left with not enough dollars to back the not enough gold to back the dollar with. First, and then it spent the decade of the 1960s trying every expedient to keep it going, creating a gold pool, making the dollar domestically inconvertible, etc., etc. When all these expedients were exhausted, in 1971 it broke the link with gold. Since that time, the Triffin dilemma of downward pressure on the dollar with expanding deficits has been counteracted by creating a vast demand, financial demand for the dollar. And again, this system went through certain hiccups in the 70s and 80s before it kind of settled down to what it eventually became in the 1990s. And since that time, we've seen that there have been vast financial bubbles. There was the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s. After that burst, that was followed by the housing and credit bubbles. And then after that burst, what we've seen is essentially the creation, largely through the easy money policy of the United States, of of bubbles in practically every asset market in the United States. So we have the so-called everything bubble. And so and what that has done is, because people think that they can make money by making these purely financial, largely speculative investments in the dollar, this inflow of dollars, largely private dollars, into the system, not government reserves, is what has kept the dollar system going. And I would say that since we are yeah, so and I expect that this system will crash pretty soon for reasons we can go into. But this is the connection between the bubbles that you were pointing to and the dollar system. And this is directly connected up with the financialization of the US economy, which has also made the US economy that much weaker productively, that much more unequal, constraining demand, etc. So a whole host of problems have come with that. With the financialization that has been necessary for the dollar system to operate.
I completely agree with you, Radhika. So, I've also gone on quite elaborate explanations and trying to get people to understand that effectively, I've also spoken about the Triffin dilemma and getting people to understand that obviously after the fall of Bretton Woods, which had to happen, which was going to happen, it was a failing system anyway, because much like you said, by 1971, the US was producing way more dollars than it had even in gold. And so eventually, when countries were demanding to have their dollar reserves changed into gold, that would have caused a major crisis for the United States. And so at this point, I actually then wanted to bring up how the petrodollar was established, because within 2 to 3 years afterwards, obviously the oil crisis had initiated at that point, whether through the embargoes that the Gulf states had actually implemented. Although interestingly, there was still obviously oil flowing through to the United States, and then by 1973 or 1974 rather, we had the agreement that was established between predominantly Saudi Arabia and obviously the United States to create to basically agree to sell all their oil in the dollar, and that provided obviously a kind of safeguard for the dollar to sustain their demand. And in doing so, that meant that the Gulf states on their part, were securing their valuable commodity to the dollar. But also in return, due to the fact that the United States had the most advanced, I guess, the deepest liquidity sort of economy, all the ample, revenue, the massive amount of super profits that a lot of these Gulf states had made at the time, the only way for them to sustain that wealth and continue and essentially expand that wealth was to invest them, and the only economy that was able enough to do so without it crippling their economy was the United States. And so from there, we had we had sort of the establishment of the petrodollar system, and we can see through that. And I've said this before, how important the Gulf monarchies are to the very foundations of the U.S. economy. So my question there that I also wanted to ask is, how do you perceive the current war in Iran, or the current imperialist war against Iran, and seeing the Iran has made it clear, and that this is what they've exhibited, all the attacks on vital infrastructure within these territories, on gas, on oil. With right now, I think the largest LNG refinery in the world in Qatar has apparently been essentially, I think, around 17 to 20% of its capabilities have now been diminished because of attacks from Iran. How do you think this is going to now affect the future of the petrodollar? In addition to the fact that obviously the United States has now has changed the status quo, even in the Strait of Hormuz. Because whereas before they had freedom of navigation, as part of, which has always in many ways favored certain countries within the imperial core, now that has actually drastically changed, with Iran saying that they're going to impose tolls within the Strait of Hormuz, and those tolls will be paid in either crypto, but most specifically yuan. And this is precisely what the United States did not want. They did not want to lose the dollar dominance that they have over the world, because it's what gives them the ability to be able to continue funding their financialized economy. Um, so my question is, how is now this affecting, the United States in terms of the acceleration of an ongoing process, that being the de-dollarization, its Gulf allies in the region, and how would you respond to an argument that I've seen made by, I guess, several analysts, let's say, who say that the United States is trying to accomplish global dominance by taking out its competitors in LNG and oil. That would include Qatar. Wouldn't that be a contradiction to its own economic safeguarding? So that would be the question.
Yeah, so again, lots and lots of questions. So let me just go, let me just try answering some of the more important, the ones that I consider more important. So the first, let me just say that, while I have no doubt that the United States has lots of plans for all sorts of dastardly things that it wishes to do to the world, on its various shells produced at various points in the last, particularly the last 35 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and and this idea that the United States could now dominate the world on its own, the so-called unipolar moment, and the idea that the United States could exert so-called full spectrum dominance on the world. I'm sure all these plans exist. I'm sure plans exist for what the United States can do to squeeze the oil supplies of the world and so on. But I would also say that, quite frankly, the unipolar moment was a figment of the Americans' imagination. Unfortunately for the Americans, it came precisely at the time when their economy was already on a downward path, thanks to the adoption of neoliberalism. And so, in that sense, actually, the last many 2 3+ decades have actually witnessed a sort of relentless decline of American relative power within the world system, whether we talk about productively or militarily or what have you. So, so that the divergence between what the United States wishes to see and what it is able to accomplish has only grown wider, and this process has reached such a pass by the time Trump comes along, that quite frankly, to me, to attribute any strategy to Trump, to find the method in his madness, is a waste of time. The only method in his madness is that in order to get elected, he had to promise Americans the moon, which he had no desire or capacity, for that matter, to deliver. As the consequence, what he's trying to do, and of course, as or rather as a consequence, more or less after the first month or two of his presidency, his approval ratings have been in constant decline. They are continuing to decline as the United States enters a a midterm election year. All the tariff shenanigans that we saw in 2025 achieved nothing in terms of impressing the ordinary American voter that Trump had made America great again. In fact, Trump had only dug America deeper into the hole, making it insolvent and all these other things, increasing its debt, blah, blah, etc. So, since the beginning of this year, what we've seen is a series, a hectic series of foreign policy initiatives, whether it is the kidnapping of President Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores. It is threats about Greenland, lecturing Europe, claiming to solve the Ukraine crisis, launching this awful further tightening of the embargo on Cuba, and of course the war on Iran. So all of these things he's doing because he wants to pull one rabbit out of the hat and say, look, I've won this military victory. I'm making America great again. Vote for me. This is not happening. And plus, he is gone far, he's gone off the deep end in the Iran war. He needs an off ramp, but he cannot find one, an off ramp that will allow him, with even the smallest shred of credibility, to say that he came out of this war with something he can call victory. This is not going to be possible for him. So we are just going to see, more and more of a out of control American administration rather than an administration calmly implementing a rational strategy that it has the power to implement. Nothing of the sort. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now, the second thing I want to say, I want to deal with this point about petrodollar. I think that the term petrodollar was once very relevant. I'm not sure it's very relevant. I know why people are talking about it, because America has gone to war with Iran. It is affecting oil supplies from the Persian Gulf. I understand that, but let me explain why this is not the best way of talking about it. I'm not saying that the two are unconnected with the mechanisms that you mentioned. They are. But those mechanisms play a relatively small part in the maintenance of the dollar system. So let me explain. So you're absolutely right that the US went off. So soon after the US went off gold, the dollar went off gold in 1971, the dollar's value plummeted. And as the dollar's value plummeted, the oil exporting countries, and OPEC already existed by this time, basically found that their revenues their real revenues were plummeting. So they said, well, if we are going to make money in these valueless dollars, then we need to charge more. We need to charge a lot more. So first, in 1973, they quadrupled the price of oil, delivering an oil shock on the rest of the world. And just as an aside, by the way, at that time, all the oil importing countries, which included Europe, all the industrial behemoths of Western Europe and Eastern Asia, they wanted to create an independent oil facility that would essentially say to the Gulf countries and the oil exporting countries, fair enough, you need to have a fair price for your oil, you can have it, but can you then please deposit your surpluses in an oil recycling facility from which we can then borrow in order that we can pay the higher price that you are asking for. And this was essentially nixed by the American administration. Kissinger, with his Machiavellian diplomacy, managed to convince the oil exporting countries to essentially deposit their dollars in Western financial institutions. And of course, the oil price rise, and given that oil remained denominated in dollars, it was already denominated in dollars and it remained denominated in dollars. Because of that, the world suddenly had, if you quadruple the price of oil, the world suddenly had 4 times as many reasons to hold dollars in order to pay for oil with. So to that extent, you can talk about petrodollars. You can also talk about petrodollars to refer to all the dollars that were made by the oil exporting countries, primarily at that time in the Gulf region, which were being deposited in these Western financial institutions. So in that sense, the petrodollar did provide a bit of a flow to the US dollar. But I have to say that this solution, so to speak, if that's what it was, created new problems, because if you're a bank and you are seeing large deposits come in, you might think, you and I, the ordinary Joe and Jane on the street, might think that, oh, well, aren't the banks lucky? Look at how many deposits they're getting. But if you're a banker, you have to say, oh my God, who am I going to lend this money to in order that I may make the interest that I have to then pay in interest to all these depositors, right? So essentially, these Western financial institutions went on a giant lending spree. They would lend to anybody who would borrow. That included third world governments, that even included socialist governments and anybody else besides. And remember, at that time, most of the Western capitalist world was already, most of the capitalist world, the advanced capitalist world, was already in the stagflationary crisis, into which it had entered in the late 60s and early 70s. There was no great demand for investment there. And in a certain sense, actually, you could see a lot of heavy industrialization took place at this time, often with borrowed money, particularly in Asia, although many countries borrowed, and also in Latin America. So essentially, what was happening is that this money was being used by essentially third world countries to further their industrialization. So this is not exactly great news for the Americans, who dearly wish to preserve not just their absolute position within the world economy, but their relative position in the world economy. So any growth elsewhere was a challenge to them. So in that sense, and plus, of course, all of these dollars further added to inflation, further devalued the dollar. The dollar came to the point in the late 1970s when at one point it hit $800 an ounce. For the price of gold hit $800 an ounce, which is a limit that has only recently been crossed in real terms. Okay, so that level has only recently been crossed. So in that sense, the dollar is now in deeper trouble than it was back in the late 1970s. But in the late 1970s, it was in pretty deep trouble. So the mechanisms of the petrodollar actually did not save the dollar. It actually cast it further into crisis. So that's one thing. Now, how did the Americans come out of this crisis? Only when Paul Volcker raised interest rates massively. Essentially asking the world to hold dollars because the United States was willing to pay vast quantities of interest on its treasuries. And of course, then you saw that the Japanese, for instance, emerged as the biggest holder of US treasuries, foreign holders of US treasuries, because so much money was to be made with, and the 1980s, remember, were a period of relatively high interest rates and relatively low inflation, which meant that you had relatively high real interest rates. And the 1980s and 1990s were characterized by relatively high real interest rates. So, so that's the situation you got. And then, we can go into greater detail. Then there was the dollar went very, very high because of the high interest rates. The Plaza Accord was necessary to bring it down, because otherwise it would have come down in a disorderly fashion, creating problems for people and so on. And then the dollar entered another doldrums in the late 80s and early 90s before it was rescued finally by a solution which has lasted for a considerable, for the last 20, about 30 odd years, which is essentially the dot-com bubble showed the way in which you could attract money into the dollar system, not into US treasuries, but as private investment in dollar-denominated assets, in this case, stocks. particularly dot-com stock. So the entire world was willing to pile into this trade. And this is what kept the dollar going, kept the dollar high. But of course, like all bubbles that had to burst, it burst. Then you got the other bubbles and so on. So, and of course, since 2000, by the way, the bubbles have been kept going by easy monetary policy, which we can talk about as well. So, but so today, it is not so much. So while of all the money coming into the dollar system and into the everything bubble, the money from the Gulf countries is important, but it is not the only country. The price of oil is not the only support for the US dollar. The biggest support for the US dollar is this casino, which the Federal Reserve has effectively opened with its easy monetary policy, which has kept the money flowing in. So if there were to be a crash, that's going to be a huge problem for the dollar system.
I completely agree with you. And, we all remember the grand tour that Trump had actually conducted in the Middle East last year, attracting trillions in terms of like the wealth funds by the Gulf monarchies that were going to be invested in tech, in NVIDIA, in Google, and all these data centers, because the Gulf states themselves are trying to position themselves as the next sort of major energy hub within the region, because the West Asia in general is a very geostrategically important region, even within the new digital era. I mean, this is something that, for example, China itself, when it talks about even the digital Silk Road, West Asia is a very significant part of that. And so Saudi Arabia, specifically Saudi Arabia, with its establishment of trying to push forward for e-cities, among everything else, is trying to position itself and diversify away from oil. And obviously, they've committed several billions, not several, quite hundreds of billions into the United States, into the tech sector. And and I agree with you, the vast majority of the wealth that has come from the production of oil from the Gulf monarchies doesn't get invested so much as well into U.S. treasuries, which, by the way, and I've brought this up quite a bit, since 2024, sorry, since late 2025, global central banks now hold more gold in reserves than US Treasury bonds, because, and this has been a growing trend. But the influx of money more so into the United States is into their stock markets, is into the stock, especially of the Magnificent Seven, particularly, for example, a company like NVIDIA. And some of
And
the
also other
assessments that we see, yeah,
asset markets. So whether it is
yeah.
all kinds of derivatives, bonds of various sorts, private
Hmm.
equity, the whole shebang. Yeah.
Hmm. And so this is now going to affect, and what I've actually also discussed this is, and I would like to hear your opinion on this. Do you believe that this is obviously now going to affect the war, the ongoing war inside, against Iran, and the sort of implications that this has had on the Gulf monarchies in the way that, first of all, they are unable to obviously be able to export at the volumes that they used to. We've seen Saudi Arabia try to sort of soften the blow by using their east-west pipeline. But now Iran has actually threatened to also close the Bab al-Mandeb, which through the Ansar Allah movement, that directly threatens them. And we are seeing damage to infrastructure within the Gulf states. And obviously, this is going to require apparently 4 to 5 years in some instances to refix, meaning that their revenues are going to take a hit, in addition to an aggressive amount of expenditure, not just to fix the damage done there, but also in civilian infrastructure, but also in defense. And I have been reading, and there have been reports that now they are reevaluating the investments that they were primarily going to be making into the United States. How will that impact all these projects and the bubbles that hold together the U.S. economy?
Very badly. That's the short answer. That is to say that, first of all, let me say that these data centers, which are being invested in, in the Western press, in the Western financial press, like the FT or wherever, people are openly admitting that it's a bubble, right? That all these investments that are taking place, very few of them are actually going to yield profits of the sort that are expected. And remember, the exceedingly high prices of the stocks of these companies that are making these investments in data centers, the price is extremely high because people who are investing are expecting huge profits. They are not going to be forthcoming. This is overinvestment, and it is also based on hype. these investments are being made under the assumption that eventually these investments, not eventually, in fact, quite soon, these investments are going to result in the production or the creation of something they are calling artificial general intelligence or even artificial super intelligence. In reality, while I have no doubt that we will get a lot of improvements in computing power as a result of these investments. We will get a lot of improvements in AI of the ordinary sort rather than AGI or ASI or whatever. And AI is nothing other than enhanced computing, basically, that enables us, that is able to process a lot of data at the same time, which is fine. I'm happy to use an Excel sheet to tot up my students' grades rather than having to use a calculator or even my fingers. Fine, I'm happy about that, but there will never be any replacement for human intelligence, which is what these MAGA companies are telling us we are going to get, which is ridiculous. But anyway, so for all these reasons, this bubble is going to burst. It's just a question of when. So that's the first thing. Now, let's deal with the Gulf monarchies, and the Gulf states in general. I think that this war has certainly imposed on them it has thrown them in the context of thrown them into an existential crisis. It's an existential crisis, obviously, for the simple reason that insofar as they are still reliant, and they're still quite reliant on exporting oil, this is hugely problematic. Secondly, insofar as they have tried to diversify away from it, they have made themselves into um, into places in this region which can be sort of the leisure park and the business park at once of exceedingly rich people from all over the world. And they could do this as long as everybody thought, they said, and everybody believed them, that they are exceedingly secure places. But and they could do that on basically because the United States provided them with security. But now, by launching this war, this Israeli-US war on Iran, what the United States has done is it has endangered the very security. It has turned the very security it claimed to provide into insecurity, because these countries, as you know, they have had their buildings bombed and their facilities bombed. So in that sense, the Gulf will never be the same again. And the longer Trump takes to find an off ramp, the longer this war lasts. As you know, it is damaging oil production facilities because apparently, and I'm no great technician, but from what I understand, once you stop using these facilities, then it takes a lot of repair and maintenance before they can be brought back into action again. So it's not like you can turn off the switch and then turn it back on, 5 months later or whatever. This is not going to be the case. Plus, the longer the insecurity, the bombardment, the possibility of Iran further retaliating in response to this crazy so-called blockade that the United States has introduced now, the more these things drag on, the more the Gulf states are going to question whether their business plan was ever viable. Now, I can imagine at this point, at some point in early in this game, there were those constituencies in these Gulf monarchies that were saying to the Americans and the Israelis, please stop. Don't do this anymore. We need to get out of this. This is not good for us. And another group saying, finish the job. But I think that now, I would say, like nearly 50 days into this conflict, I think the damage is already quite great. So I think that these countries are going to go into a crisis, into a tizzy. And finally, I would say that there is one element which is important. I forget, the FT ran a column. I forget who wrote it a few days ago, in which they said that the Gulf money that is flowing into the American system, it will stop coming in because they will need the money to reconstruct, and so on and so forth. So this will certainly be a problem for the system, for the dollar system. As a whole. And I would say one final thing, which is that this whole war on Iran, and this is very different compared to any of the other wars the Americans have been on, in that Europe has not gone along with them. Indeed, it has making great efforts to separate itself from this war. So it's essentially an American-Israeli enterprise. And I would say, and so, in Europe, for example, again, people are saying, how can we trust the Americans? Can we continue to ever trust the Americans? So this war, although NATO is not involved in it, precisely because NATO is not involved in it, precisely because Trump can feel that, look, when we need you, you are not there. Why should we support you, etc. This is going to be a breakdown of the transatlantic alliance. And so essentially, the internal crisis of the United States from which these wars spring has become so great that it is possible for an American leader to wager everything on a desperate attempt to shore up his party's election prospects. And in the process, and he's wagering it and he's losing it. You can wager and win, but you can also wager and lose. And that's what we are looking at right now.
Just to ask this final question, which I do think is important, I think it's a good follow-up. In part as well, all these, I guess wars that have been initiated by the United States, whether directly or indirectly, whether it's the war in Ukraine against Russia, whether it's obviously now what's happening in Iran, the kidnapping of Maduro, all of this, and as I had said in my introduction, I mean, it is part and parcel as well of their attempt, quite a feeble attempt, but attempt nonetheless to obviously try to target. It's part of the greater war, let's just say, against China, which is the greatest adversary for the United States, something that they haven't shied away from, constantly regurgitating. To what extent would you say, these current conflicts, but specifically with what's happening right now in Iran, has this affected China? Can it affect China? Because China, for its part, it's a very different economic model to that of the United States. There the state controls capital, and it's very organized and pre-planned. It diversifies, it thinks ahead, and it's very adaptable. And I've said this to certain, some of the platforms I've spoken on. For China, they still predominate around 60, I think around 60% of their energy consumption still comes from mining, advanced coal mining, but mining nonetheless. And I think it was around 60%. And then there was oil, renewable energy. Renewable energy right now is becoming one of the means by which China is heavily investing on. And around, I think, 9% of its energy consumption comes from gas, a lot of it from gas pipelines, and I think around, and even less, actually, a little bit more rather, LNG, which it gets from different places, Australia being one such option, and so forth. And so I wanted to ask you, given the ongoing sort of, I guess, the energy crisis that's been created as a result of this war, and the impact that it's also having on surrounding nations, but also, yeah, oil and gas importing nations, which are predominantly, ironically, the ones that are most reliant are actually American allies. So South Korea, Japan, the European Union. Um, how will this affect China, if at all? How is China positioned to withstand this? I guess I know this is a series of questions again. But and then I guess the final point, if you could cover it in whatever way you would like, how the impact of the energy shocks, the degree to which how expensive energy has gotten, will affect actually American allies. Particularly, again, I would like to focus a little bit on Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, because they are such a significant supply chain as well for the United States, and their tech industry that we've spoken about is quite an important industry for the United States going forward. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, so first of all, so there vis-a-vis China, I think you're asking me two separate questions. How is China generally affected, and how is China affected by the energy crisis? So, so how is China generally affected by the wars that the Americans have unleashed in recent times, and then how is it affected in energy terms? So, generally speaking, I would say that China has only become more and more wary of the United States. And as a result, we see, and of course, remember that the Trump administration imposed all sorts of tariffs on China in its first term, and then Biden continued them. So overall, what China has been doing is reorienting its economy away from the United States, both in terms of its reliance on the United States for exports, its reliance on the United States for technology or capital or whatever. All of this has been reoriented away. And of course, since 2014, and even more so since 2022, it has been deepening its relationship with Russia, which is now more important in terms of energy than anything else, although oil continues to come from the Gulf region. Yeah, and I would say also that in its wariness vis-a-vis the United States, it has also developed close ties with countries like Iran. And of course, Iran at this point is not a category of countries, it is in a category of its own because of the attack it is facing. So I would say the close relationship between China and Iran has also allowed China to continue to enjoy a relatively um, unobstructed access to oil, even in the midst of this war. Plus, China has also the capacity to, and has indeed undertaken, to maintain vast reserves of oil so that it has like a couple of months worth of oil in storage. So, China can do all these things because in China, you are not always looking at the bottom line. You are looking at national welfare, national security, etc., etc. And I think these are different goals from merely looking at the bottom line. So, in all of these ways, I would say that China has become resilient to the effects of the uncertainties that the United States is creating. The second point I would make in association with this general point is that, in fact, precisely when the United States appears more and more as this source of practically all the chaos that the world is suffering are emanating from the United States, right? Whether it is the tariff war, the flood of tariffs, or these, a series of wars and threats of wars and so on. Compared to that, China is emerging as an oasis of tranquility, of predictability, of reliability for the rest of the world. And I think that the rest of the world, including Europe, will be looking to China. Now, vis-a-vis energy consumption in general, I'm not a great expert on this, but I will say this. I know that China has been reducing its reliance on coal. So, it was nearly 70%. Now it's a little over like 55 odd percent or something. I mean, that's already a big come down. And it is the world's pioneering investor and developer of alternative energy sources and the capital equipment that is needed to do so. So whether it is solar panels or wind turbines or what have you, China is investing in alternative energy. And I would say that this oil crisis will only make it redouble its efforts to try to become relatively self-sufficient in energy. China has a vast landmass, much of which, we think of China and we think of exceedingly crowded cities, but that's because most of the population of China is crowded in the eastern part of China. Much of the west is empty, uninhabited. It can use this to generate as much wind and solar energy as it likes. And so I would say that, that's how China will react. And I would say that's how China should react. I think that this entire oil shock that the world is suffering should put the world on notice that the acceleration towards the energy transition to renewables can only be a good thing. And, I don't know if you saw this, but China has sent Cuba in the midst of this embargo on energy. I mean, the Russians sent them a tanker full of oil, but China sent them a whole bunch of solar panels. So either way, hopefully, I think that these ways of thinking and doing will spread.
Yeah, just to actually add on to your point about Cuba, what I found fascinating is that as of 2025, actually, China was helping Cuba establish solar parks. And we saw the greatest rapid growth in reusable energy grow from basically 5% in Cuba to 20% in the space of a year. And by 2028, the plan is China is planning to actually make Cuba entirely reliable on solar energy. Hopefully, obviously, it's going to be a tempestuous period now because obviously the pressure from the United States. But if this materializes, this would give Cuba energy independence. And so it's very interesting to see, and it's very true that China is the pioneer in, reusable green energy, and it's planning to use even, to reduce coal, like you said, and it has already made leaps in that way. um I actually wanted to add something that I had recently read. Because the United States, and we could wrap it up, but the United States, who is claiming to want to become, globally dominant in energy, because it's itself, and this is something that I think people often overlook when they believe that the United States is this, energy exporting hub of oil and gas, which again, it's sweet crude oil is different to heavy crude, and there's a lot of technicalities around that as well, and why they need heavy crude that does come from the Middle East. But also, LNG has its structural infrastructure limitations, and there's a lot of environmental and legal hurdles that come with that. But I think it was earlier in or mid 2025, the United States, under the Trump administration, has fast tracked a lot of projects to increase new developments in mining, as well as, extraction of lithium and so forth. And according to a report that I had found by S&P Global in 2024, the United States, because of it has abandoned its ability to, I guess, innovate, develop, and to develop the necessary infrastructure for new development overall. It found that it would need around 29 years in order to actually see any fruitful output from any coal mining or any sort of mining, lithium, you name it. And actually, it scored the worst in the world, with the only country being worse than the United States, that being Zambia, that needs 34 years. So that speaks volumes as to the materialities of what the United States can actually accomplish in terms of, meeting its energy requirements, whereas China is also the world's leader in refining rare earth minerals as well as lithium, as well as other sorts of valuable resources. So you can see how China, again, is very well positioned. And I just wanted to remind people of that, because there is a general scare that, that the United States is positioning itself in a specific type of way, that it's essentially becoming the, it's actually succeeding in, I guess, encircling and isolating China. But the reality is not the case. China is far better equipped. And I do
I
agree
think that
with
this
you.
is
The energy, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very interesting point. Sometimes I joke that I mean, I'm going to take a couple of steps back to answer the question. So sometimes I joke that what the world calls globalization, and I never liked the term, and I still don't like the term, but we can go into that some other time. But what the world calls globalization is nothing more than the externalization of the American economy. So if you think about, is around 1990, as late as 1993, the trade as a percentage of US GDP stood at 20%. And then at its peak in about 2008, and then a little bit later in 2011, thanks to the shrinkage of US GDP, it went up to something like 31%. So this 50% increase, roughly, in the externalization of the American economy is basically what the world was asked to call globalization. That's what it really was. Of course, there were other dimensions of globalization, but I'm just taking this as a single measure. Since then, the share of trade in US GDP has declined. So it is today stands, or in 2024, stood at about 25%. And at the same time, and that's as a percentage of US GDP. But in terms of its exports or other imports, given that we were talking about tariffs last year so much, I looked up what is the percentage of imports, world import, what is the US share of world imports of all imports in the world, and the US share of world imports, depending on how you counted it, was like somewhere between, I don't know, 13 and 16% or something like that, which is not small, but it is not huge. So essentially, the effect, you see, as I've already said, the cause of this crisis, of which Trump is a symptom. He is not an actor. He is a symptom of the deep, deep crisis of the United States. And so this crisis emerges, or Trump is a symptom of this deeper crisis, and his actions are further diminishing the centrality of the United States in the world, because the centrality of the United States in the world economy was already shrinking. Now Trump's actions, which essentially let everybody know, because what is the most fundamental need in any economic relationship? It's reliability and predictability. And if you cannot provide reliability and predictability, people will finally say, well, look, it's too complicated. We can't have any kind of relationship with the United States, because we can't rely on it to do what it says. Every other day, there is a change of mind. How can you deal with such a person? So the United States will shrink as a proportion of the world economy, and it will shrink as an actor in the world economy, that actor that matters. And I think that this is what we are looking at. This is what we are seeing.
I completely agree with you. I think it's actually a very great way to even end our conversation. And I'm very happy that you highlighted this point. Because I do think that people shouldn't try to um I see read too much into the madness, and sort of see it for what it is, and that is a desperate attempt for a declining empire that has been declining for a very long time. However, right now its contradictions are just becoming far more sharpened, and I think this is what we're seeing. And yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how we proceed. But I do see that what we're seeing right now is a battle between the old world and a new world that's being born. It's going to be quite rough. It's going to be, I always say, it's going to be very bloody, unfortunately, in multiple different ways. But it is an essential process, unfortunately, in order to bring about the sort of change and economic rather changes and opportunities for changes that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. But thank you so much, Professor, for being here with us today, and I hope we can do this again. You're
Absolutely.
you have abundant knowledge on these things, and I think it's so critical for people to hear your voice, to become acquainted with you. And just for those that don't know, Professor Radhika at the moment as well has her own YouTube page. I know that you do also publish certain things on Substack. What other platforms could people be able to find you on?
Sure. My website is radhikadesai.com, and you can find me basically on YouTube and Substack. My YouTube channel is called Radhika Desai, Geopolitical Economist, and you should be able to. I think my Substack handle is at Rad Desai. So yeah.
There you go. So if everybody, I can definitely testify that she's absolutely brilliant. Somebody I have personally read extensively. So please do look into her work. And yes, we will definitely be having these conversations again. Thank you again so much for helping us make sense of the madness, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to our future conversations.